I will take your blood because it will make me live longer. And if you ever tell anyone everything we do to you, we will kill you and your entire family.
Today you will hear the true story of Sarah Wright, who at the age of 16 was one of the victims of child trafficking, led by members of the British royal family. She says that children and teenagers were brought to those macabre events to serve as fuel for their packs. She says they believed that young blood, especially from children, not only prolonged their lives, but also strengthened their power. Luckily, Sarah managed to escape, and today leads a non-governmental organization that works to combat child trafficking around the world. Despite being a frightening story, this story serves as a warning to all parents watching us. But before that, subscribe to the channel for more revealing stories and help expose what many try to hide. Her story begins as follows.
My story begins in the 90s, when I was just 16 years old. My name is Sarah Wright, and back then I was just a teenager with ordinary dreams. I lived in a small town, full of expectations about the future, but completely oblivious to the darker side of the world. If someone had told me that behind the gilded facades of royalty and glamour, there existed a human trafficking network fueled by blood and fear, I would have laughed. But I found this out the worst way possible. It was in a hot summer that it all started. I had participated in a small cultural event in my town, a parade to raise funds for a local school. There, a well-dressed and extremely friendly woman approached me. She said I had a special shine, something that could take me far beyond that modest place. Her name was Eleanor, and she introduced herself as a representative of a charitable organisation that helped young people achieve success. His eyes sparkled with a kindness that seemed genuine, but now, looking back, I realised they were just masks. I was invited to participate in a special programme in London with the promise of meeting influential figures who could change my life. My family, although hesitant, was convinced by Eleanor's charm and sweet words. Within days, I was on a plane to England, looking forward to what felt like the beginning of a new stage in my life. But upon arrival, I realised something was wrong. The hotel where I stayed was luxurious, but there was a strange air about the place. The windows were always closed, and the corridors were cold and silent, as if they were hiding something. I was greeted by men who didn't smile, who only said the essentials, and who always seemed to be watching me. Still, I tried to ignore the discomfort and convinced myself it was just nerves. That first night, I was taken to a mansion. It was a magnificent place, but also frightening. There was something about those halls filled with gold and ancient tapestries that seemed wrong. They asked me to wear elegant clothes. They said it was a special dinner. I had no idea that this would be the beginning of one of the darkest chapters of my life. When I entered the main hall, I froze. Instead of the dinner I imagined, there was a circle of candles on the floor, with symbols engraved in the centre. The guests, many of them people I recognised from magazine covers and television shows, were there. But they weren't how I imagined them. They had something in their eyes, a cold, inhuman gleam, as if they were on the edge of an abyss from which I could not escape. It was that night that I heard for the first time the words that would mark my destiny. Blood is life. They weren't there for an ordinary dinner. They were there for a ritual. I discovered too late that I had been taken into a human trafficking ring run by the elite, including members of the royal family. Children and teenagers were brought to those macabre events to serve as fuel for their packs. They believed that young blood, especially from children, not only prolonged their lives but also strengthened their power. I wasn't chosen that night. Someone younger, more vulnerable, was taken to the centre of the circle while I was forced to watch. Chants in a language I didn't understand echoed off the walls, and the smell of iron, the smell of blood, filled the air. Everything in me screamed to run, to fight, but there were guards around every corner, and I knew that any attempt to escape would mean my end. It was at that moment that I understood the truth. The figures that the world idolised, the same ones that graced newspaper covers with their perfect smiles, were behind one of the most horrible schemes that ever existed. They didn't just traffic children, they sacrificed them in the name of a power that the world would never imagine existed. I survived, luckily, but others didn't have the same chance. Today, with my NGO, I try to expose the truth that so many are still afraid to face. But to do so, we need to revisit every detail, start from the beginning, and open the eyes of those who still believe in the perfection of power. This is just the beginning of the story, but it goes much further than you imagine. After that first night in the mansion, my perception of the world changed forever. I was no longer just a dreamy girl, I was a prisoner. The promises of opportunities and success were nothing more than a cruel bait to attract young people like me. But what I didn't yet know was how deep this scheme went and how isolated I was. The next day I was taken to a remote place, far from the city and the lights. It was an old mansion surrounded by dense forests, as if even nature was conspiring to hide that place. There was no phone signal, no connection to the outside world. There, I met other girls and some children, many of them even younger than me. They were in different states of confusion and fear. Some seemed apathetic, as if they had already given up. Others, like me, still struggled to understand where they were and what was happening. The days passed in silence, interrupted only by the presence of guards who watched us incessantly. They moved us from room to room, kept us to strict schedules, and spoke only when necessary. They never used our names. We were just numbers, objects to them. One of the girls, a girl named Lucy, was just 8 years old. She was terrified, crying at night and whispering to me that she wanted to go home. I told her everything would be fine, but deep down, I knew I was lying. Isolation was part of their method. The further we were removed from the world, the more controllable we became. I could feel it. They were slowly breaking our will, turning us into something they could use without resistance. Each day, we felt the weight of silence and distance. There was no one to hear our screams. We were invisible. But what left a deep impression on me was the macabre routine they implemented. Every day, we were gathered in a dark room where a well-dressed man, who looked more like an aristocrat, asked disconcerting questions. "Do you believe in destiny?" he asked me once, with a smile that never reached his eyes. They weren't just physically exploiting us, they were trying to get into our minds, to prepare us to accept the unacceptable. It was there that I discovered that these children and teenagers were not chosen at random. The organisation had a method. They sought out those they considered pure or promising, as if our lives had some kind of mystical value to their rituals. I discovered, listening to snippets of conversations, that the royal family believed young blood possessed almost magical properties, the key to their longevity and influence. It wasn't just a belief, it was an obsession. And we were the currency to feed this system of horrors. One day, as they were taking us to another preparation session, I heard something that froze me. Two men were talking, not realising I was close enough to hear. The next ceremony will be next week. They say the highest echelons will be there. The children need to be ready. My heart raced. They were preparing us for something big, something far worse than anything I had ever seen. I knew I needed to escape. I needed to do something before it was too late. But it was surrounded by forests, armed guards, and a system that seemed invincible. My only option was to watch, plan, and wait. I couldn't save them at that moment, but I knew that if I had the chance, I would do everything I could to expose the truth. Isolation and mind control were just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. What happened the following week was something that even now I find difficult to describe. It's a nightmare I revisit every time I close my eyes. The ceremony I heard the guards mention finally took place, and it was there that I understood the extent of the horror I was in. That night, we were taken in silence to an underground wing of the mansion. The stairs were narrow, and the dim lighting cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The air down there was thick, suffocating, filled with the smell of melted wax, burnt herbs, and something metallic that I quickly identified as blood. My stomach turned with every step, but I knew that resisting would mean an immediate end, and no one would come out to tell the story. When we reached the main room, I was overcome with indescribable terror. In the centre of the space, there was a large circle etched into the ground, adorned with symbols that seemed to pulse as if they were alive. They glowed faintly in the candlelight, placed meticulously in positions that seemed strategic. There was a black wooden throne in the corner where a figure sat imposingly. He was a man in a suit, someone who exuded authority. I didn't recognise him right away, but later I would understand that he was a high-ranking member of the royal family, someone the world saw as an icon of dignity and power. All around us, guests were positioned as silent spectators. They wore elegant clothes, but they all wore masks, some with animal faces, others with deformed and grotesque expressions. In the centre of the circle, a child was placed, a girl no more than 7 years old, tied up and clearly terrified. I wanted to scream, to run to her, but my own paralysis was as strong as the fear. The chants began. They were words in a language I didn't know, something old, guttural, that seemed to resonate in my own chest. The room seemed to take on a life of its own, with a dense energy that made the air vibrate. The people around the circle began to move in sync, their footsteps echoing as part of the ritual. And then, the most terrible moment arrived. The man on the throne stood up and walked to the centre of the circle. He held a cup, and as the chanting reached a climax, he tilted the cup so that its contents were visible. Blood. Blood that seconds before had been taken from that child. It was there that I understood the extent of his beliefs. For them, that blood was more than a symbol. It was an elixir, something they believed contained the essence of youth, of eternal life. They drank the blood of children, convinced that it would grant them longevity and power beyond what any mortal could comprehend. With each sip, they murmured words like renewal and purity. His hands were shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from ecstasy. They truly believed that they were transcending humanity. I was caught between horror and disbelief. How could the world worship these people? How could they hide something so monstrous under the shine of their titles and status? When the ritual ended, the girl was hurriedly removed. She was alive but weak, and the empty look in her eyes was something I will never forget. They didn't kill her that night, but I knew her life would never be the same, if she ever had another chance. I was taken back to my room, but the sound of chanting and the smell of blood stayed with me. That night, I made a decision. I needed to get out of there. Not just for me, but for Lucy, for the girl in the circle, for all those children who had no hope left. But I knew that to escape I would need courage and cunning, because these people left no witnesses alive. The ritual was just one part of the puzzle. What would happen next was even more sinister, and I had to survive to expose everything. As the days passed, I began to recognize faces among the participants in those rituals. These were people the entire world revered: influential politicians, industry moguls, celebrities, and, most shocking of all, members of the royal family. At first, my mind refused to accept it. How could such public figures, who seemed to represent stability and morality, be so deeply involved in something so macabre? In that same underground wing, there was a reserved space, a kind of private hall. It was there that I saw them for the first time, without masks, in their formal clothes, smiling as if they were at an ordinary social event. They clinked golden glasses and talked in low voices, but with gestures that exuded power. One of the figures in particular caught my attention, a man with grey hair and an imposing posture, someone I had seen in newspapers and television broadcasts. He was one of the pillars of the royal family, someone considered a symbol of leadership. What amazed me most was the naturalness with which they acted. To them, it wasn't a dark secret, it was a way of life. The rituals were just an extension of their power, something they performed with the conviction that they were above all judgment. They believed that children's blood made them not only stronger, but almost immortal. The idea of getting old or losing control seemed to be something they would never accept. I heard snippets of conversations as I hid in corners, trying not to be noticed. "He's getting stronger and stronger," said a woman wearing a pearl necklace, referring to the leader of the ritual. The last one was especially pure. It was not just the blood that mattered to them, but the purity of the victim, something that, for them, represented a primordial energy that could be absorbed. The name Lucy was mentioned in one of these conversations, and my heart almost stopped. The little girl I had tried to protect was being considered for a larger ritual, something they called the coronation ceremony. I couldn't understand what this meant, but it was clear that it would be something even more terrible than the rituals I had already witnessed. Gradually, I realised that these royal figures were not just participants, but active leaders of the network. They were the ones who financed the trafficking operations, ensuring that children were brought from all over the world to fuel their packs. They used their connections, their wealth, and their power to silence any threat, whether with bribes or murders disguised as accidents. One of the most memorable nights was when one of the children tried to resist. A boy, who looked to be around 10 years old, screamed and tried to run away as he was dragged into the main hall. The atmosphere was tense for a moment, but within a few seconds, the leader of the group, that royal man, just raised his hand and the guard silenced the boy with a sharp blow. There was no hesitation, no sign of remorse. He then turned to the guests and said coldly, "Weakness will not be tolerated. Pure blood must flow regardless of circumstances." I was terrified, but at that moment I was also filled with fierce determination. I needed to get out of there, expose these people for what they really were. They were not just members of a powerful elite, they were predators, beings who used their influence to destroy innocent lives in the name of their own survival. But escaping would not be easy. Each day the control increased, and the feeling of being watched was constant. They knew that even among the victims there was always someone who tried to fight back. I didn't know if they would be able to identify me as a threat, but it was clear that any mistake would be fatal. The masks these figures wore in public were perfect, but I had seen what was behind them, and the world needed to know. It took me a while to understand, but I gradually realised that in that world of horrors, children were not just victims. They were bargaining chips. Each of us had a value, a function, and a planned destiny. For the elite that ran that scheme, we were not people. We were tools, used to maintain a cycle of power and control that seemed invincible. There, in the gloomy mansion, one heard about children who were chosen. The criteria were clear to them. The younger and purer, the greater the value. Purity for them was not just a physical issue, it was something spiritual, something they believed was essential to their rituals. I became a witness to an operation so well structured that, at many moments, it seemed impossible to believe that the world had never noticed its existence. Children came from everywhere. Some were kidnapped directly from their families, while others were lured, like me, by promises of a better life. What struck me deeply was realising that often the recruiters themselves were previous victims, people who had been broken to the point of becoming part of the system. Eleanor, for example, that woman who had taken me to London, was not just an accomplice. She was a product of the same machine, someone who had probably been forced to do what she did to survive. In the mansion, I heard conversations that made it clear how trafficking was part of something much bigger. The guests talked about negotiations in a casual tone, as if they were dealing with any commercial transaction. One sentence stuck in my memory. The supplier in Eastern Europe guaranteed an excellent batch this month. They weren't talking about goods, they were talking about children. The coldness in their voices was soul-chilling. There were also special events, meetings where important figures from the world of entertainment, politics and business met to exchange favours. Children were displayed like trophies, chosen for different purposes, some for rituals, others for something even more abominable. The connection between these elites was a pact of silence, sealed by blackmail and common interests. Each knew what the other was doing, but no one dared to challenge the system. I remember one particular night when I ventured to peek through a half-open door. Inside, I saw men in expensive suits talking to members of the royal family. They didn't wear masks this time. They were calm, as if they owned the world. One of them, who appeared to be a technology mogul, pointed to a list of names. "This one is promising. Just 9 years," he said. My stomach turned. It was impossible not to think he was talking about Lucy or some other child like her. Trafficking was not just used to fuel rituals. He was a weapon of control. I saw documents that proved how public figures were involved in private parties and filmed in compromising situations. These recordings were used as a guarantee of loyalty. Any attempt to escape the system or report it meant the immediate destruction of their careers, their families, their lives. This was how the cycle perpetuated itself. I realised more and more that the children were not just victims. They were the key to the entire operation. They represented a vital link that connected these powerful figures, keeping the network intact and strengthened. And the most devastating thing was knowing that, while I was witnessing all of this, the children continued to disappear, silenced forever. My anger grew every day. I needed to get out of there, not just for myself, but for all those children who would never have another chance. What I didn't know was that time was running out. Lucy was marked for something much greater, something that would make even hell seem merciful. The night the ascension ritual was performed is a memory that haunts me to this day. Those who controlled the mansion spoke of the event as if it was something sacred, a crucial moment for the preservation of their elite. I knew something terrible was about to happen, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Lucy, the little girl with innocent eyes, was taken from the room where she was confined. She didn't cry anymore. His eyes were glassy, as if he had already resigned himself to what was to come. I wanted to scream, run after her, but I was pushed along with the others into the main hall underground, that space that looked more like a gloomy cathedral dedicated to darkness. This time, the room was even more macabre. In the centre of the circle of symbols engraved on the ground, there was a dark stone altar, cold and merciless. Black and red candles lit the space with a flickering light, and the air was heavy, permeated with a metallic smell. Fresh blood. The circle glowed with an ominous hue, as if the symbols had a life of their own. It was as if the entire room was pulsing, breathing in sync with the chants that would soon fill the space. The guests were gathered together, wearing robes that hid their identities, but I knew who they were. I had seen many of them without masks before, at dinners and meetings at the mansion. Among them, one man stood out, the same member of the royal family I'd seen several times behind the scenes. He wore a stylized golden crown and held a scepter decorated with red stones. Everything about him exuded authority, but also cruelty. Lucy was placed at the altar. Her hands and feet were tied, but she did not resist. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of exhaustion. The chants began, in a language that seemed ancient, full of words that echoed off the walls in the back of my mind. There was something otherworldly about that sound, something that made my skin crawl and my head throb. The ritual leader held up an ancient-looking dagger with inscriptions that glowed in the candlelight. He began to declaim a speech, speaking of power, longevity, and the divine gift that was about to be received. Lucy's blood, he said, was the key to renewing their pacts and ensuring that those in the circle would continue to rule the world for generations. The moment he raised the dagger to sacrifice her seemed to last an eternity. I felt my body frozen with fear, but my heart was screaming. I needed to do something. But before he could even plan, a terrible thing happened. The circle on the floor began to glow brightly, and an indescribable energy filled the hall. It was as if the environment itself was responding to the ritual, as if something was being called from the depths of the darkness. The dagger came down, but not to take Lucy's life, not yet. Instead, he cut her palm, letting the blood drip onto the altar. The chants intensified, and each drop seemed to feed something invisible, but present. The guests were ecstatic, their masked faces tilted forward, as if absorbing the energy. Then, the leader raised a golden cup, which was passed among those present. Each of them took a sip of the red liquid with a frightening reverence. Lucy, still alive, was taken from the altar, but I knew that was just the beginning for her. She had been marked as a chosen one, someone who would be used repeatedly to prop up the network. The ceremony was over, but the pain it left behind was just beginning. That night, I made my final decision. I needed to escape, no matter the risk. Not just to save myself, but to try to take Lucy with me and expose this truth to the world. What I witnessed in the ascension ritual could not remain hidden. It was proof of what the elite were capable of doing to maintain their power. They believed they were above everything, even morality and human life. I knew my window of opportunity would be short, and any mistake would be fatal. But one thing was certain. I would rather die trying than be an accomplice in that hell. After that night, it became clear to me that the figures participating in the rituals were not merely spectators. They were key players in a machine of power and control that operated in the shadows, using children as currency and blood as fuel. It was these people, celebrities, politicians, billionaires, who kept the wheels turning, with the certainty that no one would ever dare expose their secrets. Among the participants, some were figures I had only seen in magazines and news. A famous singer, known for his inspiring music, actively participated, chanting fervently. An internationally renowned actress, admired for her humanitarian actions, was one of the first to drink from the golden cup that night. There was even a technology mogul whose innovation changed the way we connect to the world. They were the public face of a system that thrived in silence, protected by their fortunes and influence. What haunted me was the way these figures used their fame to ensure the cycle continued. Institutions that were supposed to protect children, NGOs, government entities, and even the press often received donations and support from these same people. They bought into their image as heroes, while in the shadows, they sponsored the horrors I witnessed. The control didn't stop there. Anyone who dared question or threaten the system was quickly silenced. During my stay at the mansion, I heard rumours of employees who disappeared after asking too many questions. In one of the conversations I was eavesdropping on, I heard two guards talking about a journalist. He came too close to the list. He had no choice. It was suicide, officially. Those words echoed in my mind for days. The list they were referring to, I guessed, was one of many that documented the network's names and transactions. Fear was their most powerful weapon. They kept every participant, from recruits like Eleanor to tycoons and politicians, under absolute control through blackmail. During one of my assignments, I found a pile of tapes and documents in an office. I didn't have time to examine everything, but I recognized faces in the recordings. Men and women in compromising situations, filmed during rituals or at private parties. This was more than evidence. It was the guarantee that no one would ever dare step out of line. Even the smallest participants, those who just tested the system, were caught in this web. Once inside, there was no way out. Those who tried to turn away, as I heard in another furtive whisper, were threatened, their families put at risk. It's not just your life that's at stake. They make a point of remembering that, one of the guards said to another. I knew that my attempt to escape would be dangerous, not just because of the armed guards or the physical boundaries. It was the network they had built, a network of influential people who could destroy anyone who dared challenge them. However, inside me, something had changed. I was no longer afraid of dying. My fear now was that the truth would never be revealed. I needed to find a loophole, something I could use to escape, to take Lucy with me, and if possible, expose to the world the rot that these people hid beneath their masks of kindness and charity. But I knew that to do so I would need more than courage. I would need luck and a plan. The night I managed to escape was as terrifying as it was liberating. I knew it would be my only chance. He had planned his every move precisely, studying guard schedules and patrol routes. But what drove me more than fear was the idea of taking the truth to the world. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about exposing what these people were, and what they did under the cloak of their fortunes and titles. Lucy was the key. That day, I heard the guards comment that she would be taken to another location, a special retreat, where the chosen children were kept under even greater surveillance. I knew that if she was taken away from there, I would never see her again. During the night, I used a makeshift hook to open the window of the room where we were staying and took Lucy with me. She was listless, exhausted, but there was still a spark of hope in her eyes. The escape was hell. We crossed the dense forest around the mansion, guided only by the faint light of the moon. I heard dogs barking and hurried footsteps behind us. At any moment, I knew we could be captured, but luck seemed to be on our side. We found a lightly travelled road where a truck driver finally stopped to help us. He didn't ask any questions, perhaps he recognised the terror on our faces, and took us to a nearby town. From that moment on, my life became a desperate race to survive and speak. I didn't know who to trust, but I needed to find someone who believed in me. Lucy was given to a family that I knew could protect her. She didn't speak for weeks, but she was safe, and that was all that mattered. For me, the challenge was greater. I knew that the system I had escaped was immense and unforgiving. They would try to silence me at any cost, and that's exactly what happened. Within days, I received anonymous messages, clear threats. "We know where you are," read one. Once, a black car parked for hours outside the place where I was hiding. It was a message, a reminder that they were still hunting me. Still, I decided I couldn't remain silent. I found an independent journalist willing to listen to my story. He was not afraid of challenging powerful figures, but still took extreme precautions. We recorded my testimonial secret, and he began to investigate the names I mentioned. When the material was published, there was an immediate reaction. The media tried to drown out the story, calling it a conspiracy theory. But something had changed. People started to pay attention. Other victims began to appear. The elite tried to describe me. Rumours spread that I was mentally unstable, an opportunist, a criminal. Even some authorities that I had contacted opted to silence the investigation. But what they didn't expect was the strength of social networks. My account began to circulate virally, with people sharing the truth that traditional newspapers tried to hide. Today I'm the founder of an NGO dedicated to rescuing children from human trafficking. It was the way I found it to transform my pain into something that could help others. But I don't delude myself. The fight is far from over. I'm still persecuted. I still receive threats. The system I witnessed is vast, and those responsible for it remain free, protected by their power and riches. But I know that every step I take, every child we can save, is a small victory against the dark forces they represent. The truth is still coming to light, and the world is beginning to see what really hides behind the masks of power and prestige. If you are listening to my story now, know that what I told is just part of a much bigger iceberg. My goal has never been just surviving, was to ensure that those who are still stuck in this system have a chance of freedom, and that those responsible for these atrocities one day be forced to face justice.